patience. To thank John for his patience with the video here and the technology stuff, but for stepping in today. As you know, we were supposed to have one of our speakers who postponed because of the CAUT censure of U of T. So we're going to try to reschedule those speakers in next winter, but we're delighted that John could step in at this really short notice. And I, like many people who know John already, will know that it's a delight to have a talk by John on anything, but I'm particularly excited to have one on Bleak House, which is a novel I've always associated with the legal profession and not with medicine. So over to Brian Corman to introduce.
Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, my colleague John Baird. John was hired by Victoria College before he completed his Princeton dissertation, and he remained at Victoria and in the Department of English for the following 43 years. He was a devoted and popular instructor and one of the very few willing and able to teach the full history of English literature. I don't think we still have anyone prepared to accept that challenge. His dedication to his students was recognized by the university with the Joni Foley Award for Quality of Student Experience. John also took on a number of administrative challenges. He served as both undergraduate and graduate associate chair in the department and as associate dean in both the School of Graduate Studies and the Faculty of Arts and Science. He also donated his time and energy in leadership roles in both the Canadian Society for 18th Century Studies and the Association of College and University Teachers of English. It's in 18th century studies that he made his most important scholarly contributions, most notably with his magisterial 3-volume edition of the poems of William Cowper in the Oxford English Text Series, a massive undertaking that has earned the praise of both 18th century scholars and connoisseurs of editorial practice. In his bio for today's talk, John modestly refers only to his current editing of minor 18th century poets and his work on James Boswell. But his expertise extends to such wide-ranging areas as 18th century science, philosophy and religion, heroic and satiric poetry, and the place of tea in English literature and culture. Though his focus has been on the 18th century, John has long been a closet Victorianist. He regularly taught the Victorian novel, and I'm not the only one to treasure having heard his legendary lecture, A Tay Bridge Too Far, Centennial Reflections on William McGonagall. His talk today combines his interest in the history of science and medicine and in the great Victorian novelist Charles Dickens. His title is Dickens and Public Health, Infection and Disease in Bleak House. John.
John, you'll have to unmute yourself. I think you just muted yourself again. One more. There. Nope. Nope. You had it and then clicked again. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're on.
Okay. Well, before anything else goes wrong, I'd ask you all to get in your trusty time machines and go back to 1852. Charles Dickens is 40 years old. He's written 8 novels, and he's not only at the height of his powers, he's feeling for the first time in his life financially secure. He's now got copyrights generating income. He, 3 years earlier, had started a weekly magazine, which he owns and edits, and that too generates steady income. So he's now a well-to-do professional middle-class person. And in undertaking his next novel, he feels, I think, a certain freedom to please himself to do in the past. And the result is a novel that combines his journalistic interest in what's going forward and his novelistic desire to make something new, to create a world adjacent to and reflective of the world in which he and his readers live. He's going to write a much more integrated satire on English life. Satire and sentiment will be linked. They've always been present in his novels, but this time they're going to be woven together much more carefully. And from the very start, the reader is warned that this is not a flattering portrait of contemporary England, or England at any time. This is how the novel opens. London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth. And it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus, 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. Smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes, gone into mourning, as one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Dogs, indistinguishable in mire, horses scarcely better, splashed to their very blinkers, foot passengers jostling one another's umbrellas in a general infection of ill temper, and losing their foothold at street corners where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since the day broke, if this day ever broke, adding new deposits to the crust upon crust of mud, sticking at those points tenaciously to the pavement and accumulating at compound interest. Fog everywhere. Fog up the river where it flows among green aites and meadows. Fog down the river where it rolls deified among the tears of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. Fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs, fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships, fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats, fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners, wheezing by the firesides of their wards, fog in the stem and bowl of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper down in his close cabin, fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little prentice boy on deck. Chance people on the bridges peeping over the parapets into a nether sky of fog, with fog all round them, as if they were up in a balloon and hanging in the misty clouds. We can't see where we are. The ground beneath our feet is slippery. The air we breathe is sick and thick with soot. This disorienting present brings to mind the past, the very remote past, in fact, two conflicting versions of the past, one after the other, Noah's flood and a dinosaur. That megalosaurus was only about 25 years old in 1852. This collision of past and present identifies what will be a major theme of the novel, the relationship of the past to the present. Things that have been hidden and forgotten will come to light. Things long buried will haunt the living. Prophecies will be fulfilled. And if we think about it, the early 1850s are very much a time where past and present are coming into collision. When we talk about inventions and innovations, we tend to focus on the first steamboat, the first railway line, the first telegraph message. But all these things require to multiply and extend their networks before they really transform society. And by 1850, steamboats and railways and the telegraph had developed the networks necessary and the numbers necessary to really change the way people lived. Take Dickens himself, who loved Paris. In 1852, he could get to Paris easily in a day, in reasonable comfort, by train, steamboat, and train, instead of the 2 to 3 days, perhaps even longer, that it took him 10 years earlier. This is an extraordinary kind of change. And while on the one hand, London is sprouting railway stations all over the place, Euston, King's Cross, Victoria, Waterloo, Paddington. On the other hand, it remains in many ways a medieval city. It is dependent upon the horse for coaches and wagons and everything that gets pulled around. And it sees every day herds of animals being driven through the streets to the meat markets at Smithfield, so that the streets themselves are covered with animal waste. Not surprising that we need little boys with brooms at all the crossings, sweeping the streets, cleaning them for pedestrians, and hoping for a chance halfpenny to be thrown their way. And it's a medieval city in its governance too. It has a mayor and a corporation, but they are more like a chamber of commerce than a governing body concerned with the lives of everyday people. And for practical purposes, the city is divided into parishes and vestries, more than 300 of them. And of course, there's not just one city. There's no metropolitan area, no metropolitan government. There's the City of London, the City of Westminster, various boroughs in and around what were little villages and towns, now gathered into this enormous city. The only practical way to make changes in London is by acts of parliament. And acts of parliament are not always easy to come by. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of organization. And through the later 1840s and 1850s, there's a constant struggle to get things changed by a parliament that is often reluctant to move. National politics were reserved for the traditional governing class of aristocracy and wealthy landed gentry, represented in the novel by Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, who owns a great estate in Lincolnshire and a great house in London. He is devoted to his wife, a statuesque beauty, but they have no children, a token of the infertility of this governing class. Sir Leicester and his ilk are reduced in many places to an alphabetical list of aristocratic persons: Boodle, Coodle, Doodle, down through Noodle, all the way to Zoodle. And this is one of Dickens' major satirical targets throughout the novel. These people who regard themselves as born to govern, who don't bother to govern at all, who don't want to govern, who are not interested in governing. They're only interested in smiling and saying, that will be all right. Another of Dickens's targets is a small army of philanthropists and do-gooders. We would call them faith-based in our time, who are both self-regarding and blind to the crying needs of the poor and unfortunate all around them. They have eyes only for distant lands and remote peoples, who are much more romantic than the poor who are among us. People like Mrs. Jellyby, who is intent on establishing a colony, a settlement on the banks of the River Niger at a place called Boriobula Ga in Africa, which comes to no good. And an institution that had been around for 150 years almost, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. One of the famous scenes of the novel is where the crossing sweeper character, Joe, the boy with the broom, eats his rotten crust of breakfast, sitting on the steps of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, and wonders what this building is about. All it has to show him is a closed door. What the ruling classes and philanthropists are overlooking is widespread poverty and widespread disease. Dickens was very interested in illness, and there are a lot of sick characters in Bleak House. Diseases, ailments include epilepsy, paraplegia, senile dementia, smallpox, stroke, generalized anxiety disorder leading to stomach ulcer and fatal internal bleeding, and probably Meniere's disease, which is quite an accomplishment because it was another 8 years that had to elapse before Meniere actually described this disease as a disease. Dickens was extremely alert to symptoms, and characters in his novels display all kinds of symptoms. But what's very interesting about the protocols of fiction is that Dickens rarely names a disease. Only one disease is actually named in Bleak House, and that's gout, which afflicts Celesta Dedlock. And there's an interesting moment when Celesta Dedlock, talking to the policeman, the detective, Inspector Bucket, is about to apologize for coming late to their meeting because he is, and he almost says, indisposed. But then he recollects himself and says gout because he believes Inspector Bucket knows it's gout already. And gout, of course, is a comical disease. Having experienced it myself, I can assure you that there's nothing comic about having gout, but it's a disease that other people find irresistibly funny, and it has a special literary pedigree all its own. But the side of Dickens' medical interests I'm focused on this afternoon is not individual medical cases, but public health, something that we have become much more aware of in recent months. Dickens's brother-in-law, Henry Austen, was deeply involved in public health, secretary to the General Board of Health, overseeing health in London. Dickens was also very interested in the recently established officers called medical officers of health, whose job it was to inspect and investigate possible causes of disease, like cesspools and things like that, to investigate mortality and see if there was anything to be done to reduce it. And these reports, it wasn't only Dickens who was interested in them. The Times of London published these reports almost weekly. And they're interesting to read now because in a number of cases, you can see that Dickens must have been reading them or other reports like them because the descriptions are reflected in descriptions in his novel. One of the crucial areas was water. Water and air are the two essential items here. And the thing is that air governs itself. Water depends on people to move it around. And the struggles over water illustrate the kinds of problems that public health officials faced in the period around 1850. In 1851, Greater London, the whole conurbation, covered 122 square miles. But as I indicated, this was split up into a very large number of very small entities on the level of parishes, vestries, and so on, no coordination. In 1847, there had been legislation requiring, one, that all dwellings in London be supplied with running water, which many of them were not, and the Metropolitan Commission of Sewers outlawed cesspools and required all human waste to be carried off in sewers. Well, that sounds like a real improvement, and in many ways it was, but since the sewers all simply emptied untreated into the Thames, it wasn't an improvement all round. 4 years later, an analytical sanitary commission was established, which reported that 4 years after that legislation, there were still almost 1,600 standpipes supplying water to people in London. One of them appears in Bleak House, estimated to have about 40 users each. And in many localities, water had been laid on to houses which have not been provided with drains. So it's very difficult to get clean water or water of any kind around the city and to move wastewater away. There were 9 water companies supplying London in various parts of the city. 7 drew their water entirely from the Thames, 1 partly, and only 1 not at all. The largest, the Grand Junction Company, had originally drawn its water from the Grand Junction Canal, which runs from Northampton to the Thames. Customers complained that water was too hard, so some years before they had switched to Thames water. Unfortunately, as the company freely admitted, their engineer at the time had located the intake close to the Ranelagh sewer. But his successor noticed the problem and extended the suction pipe out to the middle of the river. And the Sanitary Commission quoted the directors. The directors believe that the company now gives a supply which cannot be surpassed. Now, the city was plagued with cholera outbreaks throughout this period. They were pretty constant, but there were waves that came at particular times. One such wave came a little bit later in 1854. And an eminent doctor, in fact, the Queen's physician, a man called John Snow, prepared a map which showed incidents of cholera around a particular water pump in London. And with this map, he was able to persuade the local authorities to remove the handle from the pump so that no water could be drawn from it. And cholera cases in the area immediately declined. That sounds to us pretty convincing, and it's in all the history books as the thing that convinced everybody that cholera was a waterborne disease. Trouble is, it took it about 20 years to do that. One of the things that is clear throughout all of this is the extreme reluctance of the medical profession to change its views. And while Snow, to our minds, convincingly demonstrated cholera as a waterborne disease, his contemporaries, many of them, were not convinced at all. There was an explanation. One of the problems with cholera is that it afflicted the poor far more than the well-to-do. And this fact caused a number of doctors to be constantly asking, is our current theory of cholera correct? How can it be, if it is airborne, that only the poor, or very largely the poor, seem to be afflicted by it? Well, medical theory came up with the answer. The answer was that the disease-causing nature of materials are found in low-lying areas, particularly around the Thames, on the banks of the river. And it's natural, therefore, that this corrupted air should be found in great measure in low-lying areas. And where do poor people live? In low-lying areas near the Thames. And of course, the theory that William Farr is defending there, William Farr, celebrated as one of the pioneers of the application of statistics to medicine, this theory is the theory of miasma, that diseases are caused by the air. I've got a very neat exposition of this from a book on malaria. It's a little bit before Dickens's time, 1827, but it puts the theory very succinctly. It has long been familiar to physicians that there was produced by marshes and swamps a poisonous and aeriform substance, the cause not only of ordinary fevers, but intermittents, i.e. like malaria, and to this unknown agent of the disease, the term miasma has been applied. It had certainly long been familiar. This had been the standard medical doctrine since Galen, if not before. So it was about 1500 years old at the very least. And this theory of Galen's was still standard at the time Mr. McCulloch wrote that passage in 1827. He talks about marshes and swamps, places where vegetable matter decays. It's smelly, it's disgusting to look at and touch, and it spoils the air that passes over it. I think it's important to realize that we're not talking about airborne pathogens, things that float in the air. We're talking about the nature of the air itself that is compromised by vegetable matter in the classic theory. And Dickens first apparently became interested in this when he was touring the United States in 1842. Why was it, people wondered, that in the United States so many people were sick with fevers and related ailments, yellow fever, things like that? Well, the reason, many thought, was that there were so many undeveloped areas all over the place, places where vegetable matter decayed and the air became corrupted and poisonous to those who breathed it. But by the time Dickens came to write Bleak House, there had been a change. The specificity of vegetable matter that comes from the Essex marshes, particularly in the vicinity of London, has been replaced. In 1849, John Simon, who had recently been appointed the first medical officer of health for London, a very energetic official, wrote, "The atmosphere in which epidemic and infectious diseases most readily diffuse their poison and multiply their victims is one, as I have already often stated, in which organic matters are undergoing decomposition. Whence these may be derived matters little, whether the matter passing into decay be an accumulation of straw and cabbage leaves in some miserable cellar, or the garbage of a slaughterhouse, or an overflowing cesspool, or dead dogs floated at high tide into the mouth of a river, or stinking fish thrown overboard at Billingsgate Dock, or the remains of human corpses undergoing their last chemical changes in consecrated earth. The previous history of the decomposed material is of no consequence whatever. It's decomposition of any organic matter." And that has real relevance to the novel, because one of the most deplorable scenes in the novel is a burying ground. It was an actual burying ground. Dickens identifies it in one of his letters to a friend. It actually existed as he describes it, close to Drury Lane. And this was a small burying ground enclosed by houses on three sides on a wall, and it was approached through a passage leading to an iron gate. This burying ground had been filled up, and instead of being closed, what its owners did, one of the most profitable things you could own in London was a burying ground, was to bring in a large quantity of fresh soil and pile it up as high as the windows of the first floor of the adjoining houses. Now that's British English first floor, our second floor. So we're talking about something like 10 to 12 feet of additional soil, which was then used to bury corpses. They didn't dig very deep, they didn't bother. They just dug enough to get the corpse down and scooped a little earth over the top, and that was it. And Dickens describes just such a burial. A poverty-stricken man has died of an overdose of opium, and the beadle, the parish officer, comes with a group of fellow paupers to bear off the body of our dear brother here departed. And Dickens is echoing the words of the Anglican funeral service, our brother departed. To a hemmed-in churchyard, pestiferous and obscene, whence malignant diseases are communicated to the bodies of our dear brothers and sisters who have not departed, while our dear brothers and sisters who hang about official back stairs are very complacent and agreeable, into a beastly scrap of ground which a Turk would reject as a savage abomination, and a Kaffir would shudder at, they bring our dear brother here departed to receive Christian burial. With houses looking on every side, save where a reeking little tunnel of a court gives access to the iron gate, here they lower our dear brother down a foot or two, here sow him in corruption, to be raised in corruption, an avenging ghost at many a sick bedside, a shameful testimony to future ages, how civilization and barbarism walked this boastful island together. And this brings us to the crucial disease of the novel, which is smallpox. And in order to make it clear why smallpox is so crucial, I shall have to offer a little bit of plot summary, if I can find the right sheet of paper. Here we are. The central plot line of the novel concerns a young woman, Esther Summerson. She's an orphan who has been raised in her early years by her godmother. When she's about 10, the godmother dies, and she comes to the attention of a wealthy man, John Jarndyce, who sends her to a good school. 10 years later, Mr. Jarndyce installs her as his housekeeper in his home called Bleak House. In this role, she displays efficiency, Dickens' most prized quality. He prided himself on his efficiency in anything that he did. He was furious with his children when they were untidy and inefficient, as children quite often turn out to be. And she loves others, all those around her. She makes many lives better by her active kindness. A law clerk has noticed that Esther's features bear a remarkable resemblance to those of Lady Dedlock, the wife of Sir Leicester Dedlock, the great political figure. And when Esther by chance encounters Lady Dedlock, she finds it a very unsettling experience. A series of accidental events leads to a meeting in which Lady Dedlock and Esther recognize each other as mother and daughter. Lady Dedlock had always supposed that the child she bore as a young woman was dead. Now Esther's living presence and her striking resemblance to her mother threaten a scandal. Fate intervenes. The crossing sweeper boy Joe is brought to Bleak House seriously ill, and although he makes off within hours, he infects Esther's maid with smallpox. Esther promptly quarantines herself and her maid from the rest of the household and nurses the maid back to health, only to contract the disease herself. She almost dies, but when she recovers, her face is deeply scarred. She no longer looks like her mother, a huge relief for her, despite her regret at losing her looks so completely. It later emerges that Esther's father was a Captain Horden, long since officially declared dead in a drowning accident. but he did not die, and he wound up in dire poverty, copying legal documents for a living and going by the name of Nemo. Early in the novel, he dies from an overdose of opium and is buried in a pauper's grave. His only real mourner is Joe, whom he treated as a fellow outcast from all society. Smallpox was a problem for disease theory. Well, it was an exception because it was recognized that it could be transmitted by personal contact. That didn't stop Dickens or John Simon, the medical officer of health for London, or the majority of other physicians from continuing to believe that it could be transmitted, was transmitted, by bad air, vitiated air, as they often call it. Smallpox, unlike cholera, could strike at any social level, and it was exceptional because of this personal communicability. It was also unique in that there was something you could do about it, unlike other diseases. And that, of course, was vaccination. Ever since Edward Jenner in 1795 had published his inquiry, it had been known that those who suffered from cowpox, a mild disease, were not liable to suffer from smallpox. And Jenner's findings had been so widely accepted in Europe that in at least 4 countries, including even Russia, vaccination was compulsory. In England, where it had been discovered, it was not. English liberty required that English men and women be free and not required to contract what some people regarded as a vicious disease because it was an animal disease and unnatural for human beings to have. Of course, vaccination, while it was a new and effective and relatively safe means of protecting people against smallpox, it wasn't the first effort of this kind. Before that, there was variolation, where small children were deliberately infected with smallpox because small children tended to tolerate the disease well and achieve lifelong immunity. Brought to England by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in the 1720s, and in the 19th century distinctly old-fashioned, but still practiced in Ireland. One of the many reasons for not approving of the Irish. In 1840, in response to an epidemic in the late 30s, the Vaccination Act made vaccination available free of charge to all English residents, but it wasn't compulsory. And cases continued to occur. The medical officer of health's pieces in the Times constantly, every second one at least, has a smallpox case in it. And in 1852-53, a great poll of physicians was organized throughout the British Isles to get their opinion on whether vaccination should be made compulsory. And the physicians agreed that it should. And in 1853, just after the novel ceased publication, the Vaccination Act of that year made vaccination compulsory. So smallpox is a highly topical disease at the time Dickens is writing and publishing Bleak House. And it plays a crucial part in the narrative. The man who is buried in that nasty graveyard, barely covered with earth, is known at that point in the novel as Nemo, as nobody. But he is in reality Captain Horden, the father of Esther Summerson. And Joe gets smallpox because since Captain Horden was the only man he ever met who befriended him and treated him kindly, he goes to the graveyard and sweeps the little passage that leads to the gate. And in doing so, of course, he breathes the poisoned air and contracts smallpox. He gives that smallpox to Esther's maid, who gives it to Esther. And it is that smallpox which makes Esther no longer a threat to her mother's deadly secret. So that Esther's father intervenes, in a sense, in the story on behalf of the woman whom he loved and the daughter that he never saw. I think that's the appropriate point to end these remarks.